Thank you very much, Thor. Well, it's a pleasure for me to present on the partner trial, and let me say that this is on behalf of all the investigators, the various sites involved, and this has been a huge trial. It cost some $200 million to do, and if you look at total investment in the percutaneous valves, it's been about just over $1 billion, so a massive undertaking. I have no financial conflicts, although Cleveland Clinic was paid for doing the research and the study. I was fortunate to be involved very early on with the transapical approach and joining Mike Mack, who you just heard speak, and Todd Dewey in doing the animal work for the transapical approach. We then went on to the feasibility trials, the transapical trial, which ended up being in total 40 patients, and then the transfemoral trial, which was a revival trial with 55 patients, with reasonable results considering that these were extremely high-risk patients. The cardiologists, of course, got very excited. Cardiac surgeons got rather defensive by looking at what appeared an invasion into the territory of cardiac surgery, and the question was how this was all going to end up. And here is the executive committee that put together the partner trial, and was called partner deliberately because we felt this was a partnership between cardiology and cardiac surgery and that everybody would benefit. And I think that is true with what we know here from the partner trial data. So this is the group that has been working on the partner trial. I think it's also true, based on demographics and various other reasons, that in yellow aortic valve replacement surgery is going to continue to increase. This is a summary of my analysis of the data from the STS database, that the average site, or the number of cases done on average at every STS site, isolated AVRs, is about 20, but has been increasing over time. There are also obviously new methods for doing these procedures that we didn't evaluate in the partner trial, including a mini-invasive J incision and a transaortic approach. We have done that now in a number of patients. And here's just the steps, basically a mini-invasive incision. You just put a purse-string suture in the aortic arch, put the cannulas in, deploy the device, and then you tie off. A very simple procedure and something that I think you'll see increasingly used. The other thing that we've been doing is, with a transapical approach, is putting valves into the aortic valve as we do normally, but also putting valves in valves. And here's a mitral valve that had been previously placed where we're putting another valve in the valve because of a mitral valve stenosis. And there's the final picture with those two valves in position. So the first trial that or branch of the trial that we published was the Partner B trial, and that showed the marked benefit in survival over time. In fact, at 2 years, the improvement in survival, the delta, was 67%. And this was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine with Marty Leone as first author. When we looked at this in detail, particularly the causes of death, there were a number of patients who died for what was labeled as unknown reasons. And this is basically what Mike was talking about. These are the patients who were really too frail to survive, and they died from basically total body crumble in nursing homes or hospice. But what was beginning to show up, too, is that we had a number of patients dying from congestive heart failure, although the overall incidence was much lower. And then there were surprisingly very low incidence of endocarditis, and there was one myocardial infarct, which happened to be a patient of mine who had all anticoagulants stopped. So here's the all causes of death after 30 days, a marked reduction. Cardiovascular death was markedly reduced, and congestive heart failure was considerably reduced, but we were still seeing congestive heart failure deaths. When we looked at various risk factors, and I'm just going to show these, when you looked at age, once a patient had a TAVR on the left-hand side, age was no longer a factor in survival, as was the Euroscore, and the same applied to ejection fraction. In summary, from Partner B, we saw this marked improvement in survival. The TAVI, as we called it then, now called TAVR, and that was because we had to change the wording because of CMS to make it a replacement and get paid for it. That mitigated the effects of age, STS, ejection fraction. There was less benefit in some subgroups, for example, patients with peripheral vascular disease, but mitral valve regurgitation patients had a marked benefit. Late event rate was low, and let me just make an aside here that both in the PARTNER A and B trials, we've never seen a patient with hemolysis despite the incidence of perivalvular leak. And the controversial aspect here was whether balloon valvuloplasty was an important factor. On the left here is the PARTNER A trial, which was 699 patients, and they were randomized once they were put in the transfemoral or transapical approach, the device or open surgery. Just a couple of highlights here. In the TAVR patient, a number of patients did not have a successful procedure for various reasons. Failed access, the root was too big. Some of the patients had embolization of the device. Some had to be converted for various other reasons to open AVR. So 9.5% of the patients who went into the operating or cath lab to have the procedure did not have the procedure, so 9.5%. Now, if you look at the mortality data, here's the AVR mortality rate over time out to 2 years. The TAVR had a slightly lower initial mortality rate, but by 2 years, the results were equivalent. So this was a non-inferiority trial. There was non-inferiority of the TAVR procedure. We also powered the trial so that we could look at transfemoral, and similarly with transfemoral, there was non-inferiority of that. The transapical trial was not powered to look at this, but there was an uptick later in mortality rate. But now that we have the 2-year data and out to 3 years, that is really not an issue. There were some controversial aspects. Let's just start first with as-treated mortality, shown here in red. And the mortality rate, in fact, in transfemoral versus the open aortics was significantly lower. And then the other issue was that of stroke. And this is what has been highlighted a lot. If you take all strokes or TIAs, in TAVR it was 5.5% versus open AVR 2.4%, which was significant. But if you look at the transfemorals versus the control group of open AVR, that's where the big difference was. In the open AVR group, the stroke rate was 1.4%. Now, I think that's remarkable in itself because this was a group of patients at an average age of 83 years. So excellent results. But in the transfemoral approach, the stroke rate was 4.6%, and that was a p-value of 0.04 and 3 times higher. But what's also interesting from this slide is that stroke was due to initial risk, and later there was no change in that risk. The lines were perfectly parallel. In the non-TF group, which is basically a transapical group, there wasn't that difference, but this was a higher risk group of patients. If you look at the walk test, there was some benefit with TAVR at 30 days, but at 6 months and 1 year, as far as return to function, there was no difference. There were some subgroup differences. So males did not get as big a benefit with TAVR as females. Females benefited more. And then the one that we have not entirely been able to explain is patients with prior CABG. In other words, reoperations were safer having open AVR. And that is something of a quandary because logically we would have thought that patients having, say, a transfemoral or transapical approach would be safer having that approach when compared to open AVR. The echo gradients were essentially the same, but since this is continuous data, there is a slight significant benefit for the transfemoral or transapical TAVRs. It's a matter of 1 millimeter. The other thing that we noted was that there was a high incidence of moderate or severe perivalvular leakage in this group of patients. And at 6 months, it was moderate or severe in 10.5% of patients. So according to the VARC definitions of successful procedure, and that's excluding the strokes, the deaths, about 20% of the patients did not have a successful procedure. So in summary, Partner A, it's not easy to sort of have a soundbite for it, but this is the best I can summarize it, is that TAVR is equivalent to open AVR in patients with a risk greater than 15% assessed by surgeon and a STS more than 10% with critical aortic valve stenosis, but stroke is 3 times higher with a transfemoral approach. If we look at the major complications over time, and this is basically B versus A, there was some benefit over time, and we got perhaps a bit better over time doing the procedure. The next recent report that we presented now at ACC was the 2-year data for both the B and the A patients. And in the A patients, now we have longer follow-up, and you notice that the curves are still very good and parallel over time. And cardiovascular mortality rate basically stays the same over time. And here are the predictors of survival over the long term, the multivariable analysis. And the predictors, as one would expect, include frailty issues, liver disease, mean gradients, STS score. But here's the one that has been more of a concern, the moderate severe mitral valve regurgitation. Stroke has remained stable over time, with that initial difference that we've discussed, but over time after that has been stable. So the aortic valve regurgitation is a cause for concern. If you look at patient survival with mild or moderate or severe perivalvular regurgitation, the survival is not as good as the patients who had none. Similarly, if you look at mild versus moderate, you have a separation over time. So even mild paravalvular regurgitation is associated with a greater mortality rate. So that is something that we're going to have to try and address in the partner trial, and it may be that we underassess the severity of mild paravalvular regurgitation. I mean, that's because it's very difficult to quantitate paravalvular regurgitation. The other thing that we recently reported at STS was the continued access for the transapical approach. So there has been a marked increase of the usage of transapical approach. This is the transapical by sites, and you notice that there's some variation in the Partner A trial. 43% of patients were done with a transapical approach, but that does vary from site to site. My impression is that transapical is being done more frequently because of the issues with injury to the arteries in the groin. And here's also how you see the numbers were boosted and continued access with the transapical approach. In the actual trial, there were only 104 patients that were treated with a transapical approach. And here's the data now with continued access. So you have PMA, transapical, that's a trial, open AVR, and then continued access there in NRCA. The big change here is, if you look at stroke, is that the stroke rate was down to 2% with a transapical approach. My personal argument, and I think many of my surgical colleagues have agreed with this, that the one benefit that we were expecting with the transapical approach was a lower stroke rate, and the continued access has shown that. So if you're balancing it out, there may be perhaps more risk with a transapical approach versus transfemoral, but certainly from a stroke rate risk, the transapical approach seems to be a safer procedure. And I think also for the transaortic procedure, the stroke rate is also very low. And in fact, the European data, which I'm sure will be touched on in the next discussion, has shown that the transaortic approach has, as reported at STS, had extremely low risk of stroke. So here's just the data over long term, and you see the continued access patients in orange have done very well. And similarly, as far as stroke, that has probably been one of the factors in improvement in survival over time. Since you combine stroke and mortality, the mortality rate and the combined stroke rate is best with a continued access. One of the big factors, obviously, is cost. We did analysis on Medicare patients treated around the United States, and despite what we perhaps had hoped, in other words, open AVR may reduce the cost of care for patients over 5 years, we found, analogous to smoking, that the best, or not the best, but the cheapest way to manage these patients is not to treat them at all. It's like smokers, you leave them alone, they die earlier, and you cost the system less. And that is the issue with both percutaneous valves and open AVR. They do cost more over time. And that's why we've done some cost analysis and quality of life analysis. In the PARTNER B trial, the cost of the procedure, including the device, which now costs $32,500, was $78,000. If you then start working out the numbers for years of life gained, the cost was about $50,000 per year of life gained doing the procedure. Now, how does that compare to other procedures? Well, you see there in yellow PARTNER B, atrial fibrillation ablation is more expensive for life gained. Dialysis, obviously, LVADs are very much more expensive. So as far as the cost per year of life gained, it's not too bad. One other thing to bring up is that up until December of 2010, we had reviewed 1,801 patients formally for the PARTNER trial. Now, that meant they were not patients that we saw they could right away get into open surgery, or they were, as Mike said, these were C patients. They were not well enough to have anything done. So of the patients we reviewed for potentially in the trial, and based on the exclusion and inclusion criteria, only 12% of patients got into the trial. We're now up to about 300 patients, and we still continue to have good results. But the point is, as applied in the PARTNER trial, only a small percentage of patients get into the trials and have had the procedures. And that is part of the reasons, based on our own conscience, that we have taken the approach that if we don't have an approach to treat some of these patients, and we think they otherwise are likely to have good long-term survival, we have been doing a number of patients off-label and treating them that way with a commercial device, which is now available in the United States. So looking forwards in the future, there are a lot of new devices coming on the market. The ones that are coming now down the pike, a lot of them have got benefits. They can be repositioned, they can be taken out and put in again, and I think we'll see more iterations. This was obviously, in a sense, the third iteration of the device, and I think the results have been remarkably good for what one may consider a device we couldn't adjust the positioning very well for, we couldn't retrieve, but on the whole, the results, I think, have been surprisingly good. So we get back to the issue, was this a confrontation? And really not. We all work very closely together. I think for those of you who are planning to do these type of procedures, once you've been mentored and tutored, I think it is not a particularly difficult operation. The benefits, I believe, are huge, particularly for the inoperable patients, but you do have to have a large population of patients to make it viable, and I would strongly urge you to have hybrid operating rooms or cath labs to do the procedure. There is one problem, though, and that is CMS going to pay for this? Now, CMS has a process that they go through for paying for a procedure. And this is from the draft document. We have not seen the final document, which states how many cases you have to do a year and how experienced the surgeon is and so on. But here's the quote. Is the evidence adequate to conclude that TAVR improves health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries with severe symptomatic AS who are not candidates for surgical AVR? This is PARTNER B. So their assessment, and they used the data from NICE, they reviewed also the Belgian critique of the PARTNER trial, and this is their conclusion. For highly selected patients in cohort B, the evidence is not adequate. So that is what we face with as far as PARTNER B. And for PARTNER A, basically the same question. TAVR provided no mortality benefit but significant risk of harms. Coverage should be restricted only to clinical trials rather than registries. And that is where we stand at the moment. The big question is what FDA is going to decide about PARTNER A and the safety of the procedure and the benefits. And that will probably help us with where the future lies. At the moment, the trials are obviously funded, and CMS, in a sense, funds through the trials, so that is going forwards. But the long term is a big question mark. For PARTNER B patients, the inoperable patients, we do have the transfemoral commercial device available, and we use that extensively in the patients who have the bigger arteries. So that's a summary of the PARTNER trial. There are a lot of papers on it. It's a very interesting field, and it has really come about pretty quickly with starting with the research, or where we drafted the PARTNER A and B trials and suggestions for a randomized trial in June of 2006. And this is where we stand now. And PARTNER A2, which is a lower risk group of patients, is now being studied. Thank you very much for your attention.